I asked thousands of whiskey geeks, enthusiasts, and experts what their top Smoky Islay whiskey is, and the results really surprised me. So I'm Phil, and I'm going to fill you in about the top 5 Islay whiskies. So today we're talking about the top 5 Smoky Islay whiskies. However, if you watch to the end of this video, I'm also going to talk about some criminally underrated Smoky Islay whiskies that I definitely think were missed off this list. But what actually is Islay whiskey? Well, Scotland has whiskey regions, and there's this little island called Islay, which is its own whiskey region, and it's dedicated to making some of the world's most famous smoky and peaty whiskies. And people just go absolutely nuts over this stuff. But for the purposes of this video, we're just talking about the peaty and smoky whiskies from Islay. Only put forward whiskies that were widely available. In 5th place is probably one of the most unique spirit styles you can find on Islay, and actually in all of Scotch whiskey in general. And I think it's also one of the best gateway whiskies for people who are wanting to get into the smoky and peaty side of Scotch, and it is the Laphroaig 10. This was the whiskey that was my gateway whiskey, and I'd had quite a few other Scotch whiskies before this one, but for this one, when I tried it, that's when it really clicked. That's when I was sort of like, oh, there's something to this whole Scotch whiskey thing. And it seems for many of you as well who'd commented the Laphroaig 10 was also your gateway whiskey. And what it's really famous for is obviously, well, it's peaty and smoky, but also it has this medicinal note that you don't get as much in some other Islay whiskies. You know, some people call it a burning hospital in the glass. So there are 3 things I really like about this whiskey, and one thing I really do not like. The first thing I like is that it's generally available. I get a lot of comments on my channel when I do recommend whiskies that
people say, oh, I can't find it in my market. Like, where is it? I've never seen that whiskey in my life.
Whereas this one, I'm pretty confident you will be able to find it. It's in bars, it's in bottle stores, in some countries you can find it in supermarkets. It's also just good value. It's generally a little bit cheaper than a lot of other 10-year-old scotches, so it remains a great one that I like to recommend to beginners who don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on their first bottle of whiskey. It's also great that it's got a 10-year-old age statement. It's kind of rounded it off a little bit. I'd definitely recommend this over the Laphroaig Select. Like, if you can spend the extra few dollars, I do think go for the 10-year-old. And that leads us to the thing I really do not like about this whiskey, and that is it doesn't reach any of the stats we like to see on our favorite Scotch whiskies. It is 40%, although you guys in the US, you guys get this at 43, which I think would be good, and I'm slightly jealous of that. And it's also chill filtered, and it's colouring added to it. I think kind of the consensus from all the comments that you guys posted, you find that it kind of lacks complexity. Like, it's still smoky and punches you in the face, but it can be kind of like still thin on the palate, but it still remains a classic. It's a gateway whiskey, but it's a whiskey that a lot of us are now moved on from when you go down your whiskey journey. And if that's where you are on your whiskey journey, you want to explore the next thing after the Laphroaig 10, go for the Laphroaig Quarter Cask. It's 48%, a lot more punchy. But also, the next whiskey on this list is also a very punchy whiskey and a favorite for so many of you. So that leads us to number 4. So the next whiskey on this list is incredibly punchy and powerful and incredibly famous for people who love Islay Scotch whiskey. And in fact, I was kind of surprised it wasn't even higher up this list. So maybe it says a little bit about how people aren't as obsessed over this whiskey as they were a few years ago. But what is that whiskey? It is the Ardbeg Uigeadail. So I think 10 years ago, this could have easily have been number 1 on this list. I remember when I was first getting into whiskey, jumped onto Reddit to get some recommendations, and everyone was like, you need to try the Ardbeg Uigeadail. The Uigeadail is incredible. These days, you don't really see that same level of hype, but it's still the favorite for so many, and that's because it's a really punchy dram. This one is 54.2%. And the thing is, when I personally drink Islay whiskey, you want that kind of full-on, punch you in the face peat smoke experience. You're not going into a whiskey like this wanting some subtle Highland experience. It's also got some nice sherry cask influence, which introduces some of this nice red fruit notes, some raisins, some Christmas cake, which together gives us this nice rich fullness and really long finish. It's also got some other great things about it: unchill filtered and natural colour. But it also is pricier than a lot of the other go-to Islay Scotch whiskies. However, I don't think that means it's overpriced. It is 54.2%, and normally when I drink it, I add a little bit of water to it, meaning you get a lot more whiskey per bottle compared to some of the other special release whiskies that Ardbeg do, which I do genuinely think are overpriced. I still really love the core range from Ardbeg, and this Ardbeg Uigeadail is one of my favorites. So the next whiskey on this list is the whiskey that I expected to be number one, and it'll be interesting to see why it's no longer seen as the number one Islay Scotch whiskey anymore, and you have to wait till later in the video we find out what is the new number one Islay Scotch whiskey. And it's also Nick Offerman's favorite whiskey, and if you haven't guessed it yet, it is the Lagavulin 16. So I think the Lagavulin 16 is the ultimate gateway whiskey from taking people from being like a casual whiskey drinker to an absolute enthusiast and geek about whiskey. The amount of times you guys have messaged me on Instagram saying this was your gateway whiskey, it's just amazing, and now I just really want to explore the rest of Scotch. It just happens time and time again. It's also a little bit more of a subtle peat compared to like the last two. It's a little bit more sophisticated, it's a bit more rounded. It also has some sherry cask influence like the Uigeadail, but it's a bit more subtle. Some of those like red fruits coming through, which adds like a little bit more layers, some more complexity to the dram. Now a few years ago I rated this the number one whiskey to gift at Christmas time, but I wouldn't actually give it that ranking now, and I'll get into why shortly. Also on the Whiskey Tribe video, similar to this whole concept, they asked their community about 4 years ago what their favorite Islay Scotch whiskies were, and this one dominated.
This had more than double the votes, coming in at number one by far, a wide margin.
And you know,
But what happened? Because when I asked you guys on Discord and Instagram, it wasn't number one, it wasn't even number two, it came in at number three. So still a favorite for many, but it is falling down the ranks. Why is this whiskey being dethroned as the king of Islay Scotch? And so there's a few reasons we can speculate. It's 43%, it's chill filtered, it's got colouring added, but I don't think that's the reason. Because I still think the liquid is really good and a lot of people are willing to look past that, especially for nostalgic reasons. I think the main reason is the price.
it's just too much money.
Recently, this whiskey has skyrocketed in price, similar to its sister distillery Talisker, what they did with the Talisker 18. Just one day they decided to like double the price, and now they're marketing this as a much more premium product, similar to some Macallans, similar to some Dalmores. You know, this is kind of not so much a whiskey for whiskey enthusiasts who really want a nice smoky Islay gateway whiskey. And saying all that though, I still think the liquid is very good. I feel very nostalgic about this whiskey, and I do think it's one of those whiskies that you need to try at least once. So the next two whiskies I'm really excited about. I definitely think they deserve their rankings. And the next one is basically my benchmark whiskey. Anytime I try a new Islay Scotch whiskey, this is the whiskey that I'll compare it against. It's 46%, it's unchill filtered, and I'm pretty sure it's natural colour. And if you haven't guessed it, it is the Ardbeg 10. So this is an absolute classic Islay punchy smoky whiskey. It's not kind of like as medicinal as like the Laphroaig 10, but I really like the interplay it has between like the barbecue, campfire, peat smoke notes mixed with this kind of more clean, crisp, citrusy, savory notes. So there are two things I really like about this whiskey. The first is it's generally available. You can find this whiskey in most places, and also I think it's good value, a bit like the Laphroaig 10, but unlike the Laphroaig 10, this one's 46%, not 40%. And for those reasons, this has kind of become a perma shelf whiskey for me. It's one when I finish, it gets replaced. However, some of you said that there is some batch variation with this whiskey, and others of you suggested that the 10 is nowhere near as good as it used to be because Ardbeg now must be using the good casks in their special releases and not in their core range anymore, which has brought down the kind of standard quality of the 10-year-old. And saying all that, I still think this is one of the best 10-year-old smoky whiskies you can buy. And a lot of you called it the king of Islay, but not for this video. There was one whiskey that did dominate this whiskey. It also was a 10-year-old, and it received so many more votes, and it is our number one Islay Scotch whiskey. If you're like me, you've probably got a whole shelf of different whiskey glasses, but what if I told you that there was actually a glass out there that did it all and more? So I want to thank today's sponsor, which is DIAMAS, for bringing us the DIAMAS Tumbler. It's basically the Swiss Army knife of whiskey glasses. This groundbreaking glass redefines how we enjoy whiskey, whether on the rocks, neat, or in a cocktail. And check out this 12-sided granite cooling stone. Now, I've never really been a fan of cooling stones, especially these small ones. I always find they kind of heat up too quickly and just seem a bit pointless, but this one's larger and it fits perfectly in the glass, so it maximizes that spirit to stone contact and it'll stay cooler for a lot longer, like 40 minutes. And this is really cool. So basically there's all this like fluid dynamics happening in the glass that help aroma. And that's because of the 5 convex design. So when you swirl the glass, it hits each side, disrupting the liquid, and then it accelerates the oxidation, giving you kind of a symphony of aromas in a tumbler. And even with the wide opening of this glass, I was blown away with how much aroma it actually captures. It's social too. It means when you sip it, you can keep eye contact, keep the conversation going, and it means you don't have to like look at the roof like some other whiskey glasses just to take a sip. So reserve your seat to get a DIAMAS Tumbler right now and become a pioneer backer. That means you'll be able to snag a bunch of lifetime rewards that won't be offered again after this launch, and all the details are available down in the description, so make sure you click that link. I think 4 years ago, this wouldn't have even ranked on the top 5, and now it has shot up the ranks for so many of you. And it is the Port Charlotte 10. It's really cool to see a distillery, which was only reopened not that long ago, beat out all these big classic Islay whiskies and distilleries. You know, like the big cult distilleries, Ardbeg, Laphroaig, Lagavulin, and not by a small margin either. This whiskey absolutely dominated. So if you don't know much about what the Port Charlotte is, it's actually from the Laddie distillery, and they have 3 main releases. They have the Classic Laddie, which is an unpeated whiskey. They have the Port Charlotte, which is kind of like the peated whiskey, and then they have a super peated, like more premium, expensive whiskey called the Octomore. So these guys are really well known for their integrity, their transparency. It's unchill filtered, it's natural color, and it's above 46%. In fact, this one's 50%. So this one you're getting more whiskey for your money. It's a punchier dram, especially for a standard bottling. And also Laddie are really well known for their like innovation. They always playing with like terroir and barley types. So there's actually an Islay barley version of this, which is also really good. And they also play around with cask types. So normally the 2 big casks in Scotch whiskey are ex-bourbon casks and sherry casks. So this does use ex-bourbon casks, but it also introduced some French red wine casks, which is really cool. Some people think wine casks are gimmicky and like, you know, they're not as good and that sort of thing. I have to disagree. It's just about choosing the right red wine casks, and Laddie have really shown how it can be done well. What I really like about the Port Charlotte is that it's peaty like the other whiskies on this list, but it also has this really good like smoky bacon note that I just absolutely love that I don't get on most other Islay Scotch whiskies. It's also got some really nice honey, some tea, some salty notes, and some really good citrus notes. So overall, I absolutely agree with your number 1 pick that you guys voted for on Instagram. If you're not over there already, go join me and on the First Fill Fan Discord. Just a side note, if you don't have people around you who's obsessed about whiskey as you are, or maybe you're just a beginner to whiskey, you want to learn more, it's the place where we share, we enjoy, and we connect with each other. But I do think some whiskies on this list were missed. The first one is a whiskey that is the rising star in Islay Scotch right now. It's kind of like the new Laddie. All their bottles at 46%. It's unchill filtered, it's natural color, and I do think in future these whiskies from this distillery will be ranking at the 1 and 2 spot. It only just missed out, so it already is a favorite for so many of you, and it is the Kilchoman Loch Gorm. This is a fantastic whiskey, has some really nice sherry cask influence. There's also a cheap option called the Kilchoman Sinag. I also really like that. The last one is what I think is the best peat monster Islay Scotch whiskey, and it's not the Octomore. It's the one if you really want to go all out, put the foot down, and have the ultimate Islay experience. And it is the Laphroaig Cask Strength. See, normally I probably would have said this was the Octomore, but I think Octomore is getting kind of pretty expensive these days. This one is actually a better price for me in my market. This one is bottled at 56.5%. One thing you should know though is that even though this list was the best Islay Scotch whiskey, I don't actually think there is a best, because often the best is more a reflection of where you are on your whiskey journey and not what's objectively best. Like at one stage the Laphroaig 10 was the best whiskey for me. If you're curious though and you want to see which whiskies did surprisingly terribly on the poll, jump over to the First Fill Fan Discord link in the the description. And if you want to support the channel, join me on Patreon. But above all, share and enjoy. Beauty.